How'd you pay for college?
We took out an $80,000 loan. Capital One has this program called CODA. With CODA, this is a boot camp that's 6 months. When I joined, Capital One brought their new hires to Virginia for like the first week. So it was engineers, like the tech development program, like that's what I was in. So everybody that was in the tech development program was actually onboarding at the same time as people in the CODA program. I didn't know like there was this whole program like where you could come in with not necessarily an engineering background, work for 6 months, get paid, and then transition into the tech development program. Whereas we're just joining in the tech development program, right? So they're just 6 months behind us, but like eventually they're going to come in and like do the same thing as us, same work, same pay. And so you look around and you go like, um, why didn't I do that? Like that sounds pretty cool.
What's good, everybody? It's Andrew Baines, the host of the Custom Journeys podcast, back with another episode today. I'm really excited about today's guest. We got Mr. Richard Henry. He is a software engineer at Chainalysis and a computer science grad from Princeton. So I'm really excited to learn about his story, how he kind of got to where he's at, and then also provide you guys with tips and insight on how to get into tech and progress your career in tech. But Richard, bro, I appreciate you for hopping on, man. How's it going?
It's going great, man. Thank you for inviting me. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we can tell some good stories along the way.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, bro. So, man, like I said, like, let's go ahead and get into it. You're at Chainalysis. It's a tech startup, right? It's not like a old Fortune 500 legacy company.
Definitely.
Um,
It was in 2014, so it's pretty young, relatively speaking, but it's also in that weird stage where it's not necessarily just a small startup anymore. Like really starting to look into some big companies, some big partnerships and stuff. So we're really in the scaling stage, I would say.
you're a software engineer. At your core, you guys are problem solvers. Why don't you tell us some of the problems you're working on and some of the things that you're doing in your current role at Chainalysis?
Yeah. So the biggest problem right now is just speed and scale, right? The basic point of chain analysis is to provide as much data as we can for as many blockchains as we can. And the whole point of this is that regulators, governments, financial institutions, other crypto companies, they need to know what's going on in like so many different blockchains because in order for crypto to become mainstream adopted, like people need to know that what they're interacting with is legit and not some criminal source or anything under the water. So all of that to say, we need to get our data out. We being the clustering team, we have to get as much data out to as many teams as possible so that we can start to take all these various like crypto addresses that belong to various different people, run our clustering algorithms on them and try and push them out to as many different teams so that they can build all the tools they can, right? So Chainalysis has a whole suite of tools ranging from a bunch of different parts of the industry and a bunch of different monitoring tools. And the more that we can support and the quicker we can support that, the more that we can feed the demand because like, every couple months there's a new blockchain. If that, I'm probably over exaggerating. It's probably more like every week or something. So the more we can do, the better. And the faster we can do it, it's only going to push our business up even more.
Do you provide services just to like the government and like reporting agencies, or do you also provide like a customer based like product for people who want data on different like blockchain technology or crypto?
So the main focus is on companies and governments and financial institutions and things like that. I've heard the odd story here and there of like a specific like single customer wanting to use the tool, but that's few and far in between. Like the main goal is so that all these different bigger companies that want to have anything to do with crypto can understand what's going on there.
Exciting stuff. Crypto is obviously still pretty hot, pretty talked about topic. So it's cool to see like there's a lot of different opportunities, I guess I would say, like in terms of like the job market. I think a lot of people just think of like day trading or trading crypto and Coinbase and stuff like that. But it's cool to see like there's a whole nother set of jobs and opportunities that people can pursue that they may not even be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I came into the crypto space by accident. Honestly, I mostly joined Chainalysis because I like the people and I
Uh,
team I was going to join. So Chainalysis is in this really unique space where we aren't trying to make a cryptocurrency right now, right? Like we're not trying to push out some sort of different blockchain or anything like that. Our goal is to just be some kind of monitoring source for everything that's going on. So we feed off of just the crypto activity in general. So the more people get into crypto, the more people are interested in crypto, the more we grow essentially. The more people are curious about how to integrate crypto into their own business models and their own financial products, the more we grow, right? So it's a great way of like having your hands in so many different parts of the crypto industry. Like I learn different crypto terms all the time, pretty regularly updated by various parts of the crypto news. So it's a great way to kind of like oversee an entire growing industry. So
Mhm.
like totally by accident, honestly.
So let's get into your origin story of how you got to where you're at. I know you said you kind of stumbled into the chain analysis role, but even before that, you're based in the Brooklyn area, went to Princeton, you're a Haitian immigrant. So it's very interesting that like the path that you've kind of taken from Brooklyn to Princeton to where you're at now. So my first question is number one, like what got you into computer science? Like what was the first spark that made you interested in it?
Yeah, I mean, I was one of those kids that was like on the computer since like, I don't know, I could talk, I guess, like 5 to 7, somewhere in that age range. I was already on the computer,
Yeah.
uh, playing computer games and stuff. And so I just always kind of thought like, oh, software engineering is like all of that, right? Like the internet, computer games, all that kind of stuff. You know how like, you know how people are always like looking to the kids to like fix the TV or like fix the
Oh
cable.
yeah.
That
Yeah.
was always me. I'm not a hardware guy by any means, but I just like know how this stuff works at some level. And like, so I've always like been around tech. It always felt kind of natural to me. And I think the biggest selling point was when I was starting to try and figure out what I wanted to do career wise. I think I just realized like I don't know what I want to do. Right? There's so many different industries. So I was
Mhm.
like, let me pick something that's flexible. So I think the magic of tech is that like every industry needs tech at this point. Like pick
Yeah.
it, they at the very least need a website or an app, right? So I was like, if I do tech, if I become a software engineer, then no matter what I want to do, I can probably find some way to be a software engineer in that, right? So I think my career right now is just about building up skills and understanding how to be a good software engineer. And then like the next stage in that is trying to like take those skills and apply it to a field that I find interesting or appealing. So really just that flexibility was what drew me to it.
Yeah, I think a lot of us get, like, bored or tired of the same job each and every day, but depending on your skill set, that may be all that you're fit for, but given the fact that you're, like, a software engineer, you can apply it to anything, like, the nonprofit space, for-profit, crypto, banking, real estate, like, literally any and every industry, so I think it's a wise choice that you made even as a teenager.
Yeah. I mean, like even entertainment, like music, art, like
Yeah,
everything, something, right? And so it's like, pick the stuff that interests you and throw some tech at it and see what happens in some sense, right? Or like better yet, just watch what other people are doing and then you can kind of tag along, right? It's not even necessarily that you have to figure out how to apply tech to a particular industry. Some people are already doing it, right?
yeah,
NFTs, a great example. It's like somebody had this great idea that was totally tech based. Somebody else took it and was like, we can use this for music and art and stuff. Somebody else made a company for it. Now you just have to come in and apply and then work with that company. And now you're combining so many things that you love. And
yeah.
then like it, you can just go somewhere else, right? Like that's the kind of flexibility that really like lets people like me kind of breathe easier because I don't have to like be married to something in terms of like I, you know, I studied mechanical engineering or something. I need to work in like the aerospace industry or like I need to work with cars. Like, the line like only goes so far if you have like a very specified set of skills.
Yeah, and that's true. As a mechanical engineer, bro, I feel like you kinda, took a little jab at me, but it's completely understandable, and I think, like, the biggest thing is the skill set. I tell students, high school students and college students that are like, thinking about engineering, mechanical engineering or civil or electrical, you gotta think about, like, what skill sets are gonna transfer even beyond, like, the job that you're probably gonna get right out of college. So, you need to know how to code. I don't care if it's required or not for, like, your degree program, but that's a skill set that you can transfer to, like, any other jobs. For the ones that don't have the skill set that's transferable, it's real hard to, like, make that pivot, and then you end up trying to go back to grad school or something like that. So I'm with you 100%.
And I mean, you see that a lot in software engineering, right? You hear the story of the person that went back to school. They weren't even in tech, and so they went back
Yeah.
and got bachelors. They were in STEM, but they weren't specifically in CS. So like they went
Mhm.
back as a computer science degree, or like they weren't in school at all, so they joined a boot camp, right? So that you hear all these different examples. But I think that also just speaks to like it's not just flexibility for software engineering in terms of like, okay, I am a software engineer. What industry do I want to work in? It's
Yeah.
also flexibility in terms of like I want to do something different career wise, like overall. So what can I do now? And software engineering is one of these interesting places where like a lot of the lines are starting to be blurred in terms of what's required and what's expected, right? Like
Mm.
you don't necessarily need to go to school and study CS to be a software engineer.
Yeah,
You
that's
just
for sure. Yeah, we're gonna get into it. Hold that thought because I do want to talk about that because I know like one of your previous employers, like they started bringing in people that had like the non-traditional pathways and stuff like that. And you might have been looking like, damn, I got a degree from Princeton, but I'm working with some guys that like just have a boot camp certification or whatever. So I think it's interesting the way like some of these doors are being opened and new opportunities created. And I'm all for it. I love it. I love to see it. One of the unique things about you, the fact that you went to Princeton, Ivy League school. If your parents are like any of the other immigrant parents that I know, like, I'm pretty sure you only had, like, 3 options in terms of career, like engineer, lawyer, doctor, something along those lines. And so not only that, but I'm pretty sure they, like, really stress the importance of education. So kinda talk to me about, like, not only the importance of education in your family and in their upbringing, and then how that kind of and then also the importance of you going to Princeton.
yeah. So I was supposed to be an engineer, going to MIT and getting a PhD, and my sister was supposed to be a doctor at Harvard, right? So that was what the trajectory was before we even had any concept of what that meant. Neither of us ended up where we were expected to be, but I think a lot of that kind of shaped our initial upbringing. So my mom has always been big into education because she's worked in high schools in Brooklyn, like since I was born. So there were always spelling books, reading books around, and she was always making me read and do all these like writing exercises and stuff like that. So then you had my dad on the other side, right? So my dad has two master's degrees, one in financial engineering and then one in electrical engineering.
Oh,
So,
wow.
then I'm sitting with my dad every night, like, from, like, 5 years old onwards, like, doing math homework and, like, just watching him, like, slowly lose his mind over the fact that I couldn't find needles and stuff. So, it certainly was a character building age for me, but I think there was always this focus on education. There was always the long-term view, right? So, like, we weren't just taking stuff like year by year, honestly. Like by the time I was in school, like there was already like an idea of like when I ended at like 17, 18, where I was going to be. So I
Mhm.
think I'm that because like it always gave me a long-term view of things and like understanding like how to keep myself on the right track. Cause it's easier to course correct the earlier you look at something, right?
Yeah.
Uh, when I came in to high school freshman year, like we were already thinking like, okay, like we're gonna try and do this Princeton thing for real. At a certain point, it was just like, no, like we have enough evidence, like we could probably do this, like so let's do it, right? And so from freshman year, I was just running till the end to try and get into Princeton, and I managed to get in. But it just it wasn't necessarily a surprise, you know, like we had prepared for it all the way. And like there was always this idea of like, we need to just do as much as we can. Like we don't even know if we're gonna get it. But like the more we can increase our odds, the more we can kind of look at it at the end and be like, no matter what we did, we tried our best. The end of that story is actually the one school I did not get into was MIT. So that's the funny story.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
crazy. Man, I was laughing, cracking up when you mentioned, like, your dad getting frustrated with you because 'cause I'm even me with my engineering background, my oldest son is 4, and I'm like, "Yo, you should be able to pick this stuff up pretty quick." Like, so, you kinda, like, project onto them. You're like, "Hey, you went through calculus 1, 2, and 3," and you just
Yeah.
automatically think your baby should come out being able to do derivatives. So it kinda feels like you might have caught some of that with your dad, so that was just a funny moment for me.
Yeah, it's tough, right? Because like, it's I've been through this and you're my son, so like, what's up? Like, what's going
Yeah,
on? We need you to step this up. And it's so hard to think back to when you didn't know it, right? Because in some sense it becomes a part of it. But like you figure it out as you go. And
yeah,
like I have nothing but gratitude for my dad for like actually just sticking with me for that long because you know, I have a lot of like where I'm at right now is because of him, right? Like just
of
even having,
course.
yeah, like I don't know if I would have thought of that, like going to an Ivy League school on my own necessarily.
Mhm.
Like, that it kind of just was always there. And like, regardless of like how it ultimately turned out, like the flexibility I got from that experience, I think a lot of people are looking for that flexibility right now. Like
Yeah,
no matter where I go, it's not the same the further I get away from my graduation date. So, like, I'm 4 years out right now,
mhm.
but every so often, like, because you went to Princeton, like, slips into the conversation, you know?
Gotcha.
Like, it always just slips in there somehow, and it does separate you in some ways, and
Yeah.
it does allow you a certain flexibility and a certain, like, ability to choose what you wanna do.
Certain doors that I'm sure the name Princeton can get you into that, another school just can't get you into. So I'm sure there's certain opportunities in there. And even to your point about like preparing for success, like I think obviously the likelihood of success increases exponentially if you're actually like preparing and taking steps for it versus just like planning on stumbling into it and like not making any plans. It could still happen, but the likelihood is not as high. So I think it's great that like your parents were really active in your life, like with planning out putting you in the best position, even if you didn't live up to, like, their original expectations. I mean, you turned out pretty good, so, I mean, it worked out in the end.
I
Um
mean, my mom, the bachelor's degree is hanging up in her living room, but, she still slips in like, "All right, what's next?" There's
okay,
a
so it doesn't stop. I got you.
man, like, I love my parents, but they keep me on my toes for sure.
Alright, that's cool. I wanna kinda give you the floor to talk about what are some steps that people should take if they're hoping to get into Princeton? Like, what should they be doing to kinda, like, distinguish themselves from the competition?
In one word, everything, right? So,
Okay.
I think the strategy that I took and the strategy I think I would recommend for most people trying to do that is you are trying to throw as many darts as you can to hit the board in some sense.
Mhm.
So like it's really not enough to just have good grades, right? So like I had good grades. Well, I mean, to be honest, like I had solid grades. So like pretty much straight A's. And my test scores were up there. They were no near perfect, but I heard stories of people with like higher test scores than me and, comparable grades to me that weren't doing it, right? So academics, like it's an interesting strategy, but I haven't necessarily seen it play out the way people wanted it to. If you can do sports, that's great. If you can do music, that's great. If you can do any sort of activity that kind of differentiates you and gives you some sense of personality, like go ahead and do that. I did both, right? So I played tennis and I played trombone. Volunteering is another part of it. So if you can sort of find different ways to help out in the community, National Honor Society was one of those things for me. The final part of that is like really displaying your personality, right? So when you're starting to get into these later stages with some schools, like you may interview in person, you may have a
Mhm.
phone call, probably have an essay. So start to develop that story of how you want to tell your story, what's meaningful to you. Try and come up with a good idea of why you want to go there, right? So the more you can become intentional about why you want to go to an Ivy League school, the better it's going to read on paper. Because like in some sense, like of course everybody wants to go to an Ivy League school, right? Like it's in all the movies. It's what all the teachers are expecting of like all their top students.
Yeah.
We know there's a certain prestige that comes from it, but the more you can start to personalize that story, talk about what you want to do with that degree, right? What you want to do at that school. Who do you want to work with at that school? And That's why I might advise like people to be specific about the Ivy League schools that they apply to, right? So you hear these stories from time to time of people like just applying to every Ivy League school, right? In some sense, that's not valuable because like you're just picking all the top schools. But when you can start to look through the different schools, go on tours, talk to the staff, talk to the professors, get a feel for the campus and the people there, you can start to say like, oh, wait, like maybe I don't necessarily want to go to Princeton, but like Penn looks really cool to me. And like, I have a reason why I want to go there. Maybe I have this great professor at Columbia I want to work with. So the more you can start to understand the school that you're trying to apply to and how it fits into your life and your broader story, I think the better. I think that's about everything. But
Yeah,
yeah,
man.
in short, do everything. Do
Yeah, yeah,
everything,
yeah.
do a little more.
No, it sounds like it's literally everything. I guess the main takeaway is like being well rounded,
Yeah.
but then also like getting started early. And that kind of ties into like our discussion earlier about like not just stumbling upon success. So I think it's well stated that like you got to get started as early as you can. And if you're in your junior senior year of high school, like this is as early as you can start, like go ahead and get started today. So I think it's all like good advice. Um
Yeah. And it's also just worth like thinking about like, do you want to go to an Ivy League school? Right. Like I do think I should have thought about that a bit more, right? Because in some sense, like it's a lot of work to go to an Ivy League school. I think like some people like are just like beasts in high school. And so they can just like think about it like right when they're about to apply in their senior year.
yeah.
Right. But like other people like just do solid and have great um stature as an applicant. And so they don't necessarily like meet the expectations for an Ivy League school, but if they wanted to go to a great non Ivy League school, they could like without any extra stress, right? Some people
Yeah.
just put in school and so they could just naturally progress into applying to schools, right? So it's worth thinking about that.
Let me ask you this. How'd you pay for college? Did you take out loans at all or did you?
Yeah. So we took out an $80,000 loan. I'm like halfway through that right now. So I've been paying that essentially since I graduated.
All right, perfect. So, well, not perfect. You got student loan debt. I don't know.
Yeah.
Not perfect. But so the reason why I asked that is because I want to know, in your opinion, like when I think about you, I feel like you could have got a free ride, like a full ride at like probably any other non Ivy League school. I don't know like your financial situation or whatever, but just like academically, I'm thinking like, hey, if Princeton took you and you paid 80 grand for that, you probably could have got into like a great tier one public university or even a private school and like maybe got a full ride. So with me thinking that, and I don't know if that's a correct assumption or not, but in your opinion, was going to Princeton worth it?
It's a complicated answer because it's like how much of my life is like directly impacted by the fact that I went to Princeton, right? And I guess one of the things that I've had to deal with is like I'm constantly in rooms where like most of the people didn't go to an Ivy, right? So my first job, I worked at Capital One. A lot of those people are hired from Virginia universities, right? So University of Virginia, Virginia Tech, fill in the blank. So like you're not necessarily like you in some sense I didn't need to go to Princeton to go to Capital One, right? But there's also the fact that like if I open up my LinkedIn right now, like I probably have like countless messages today that I haven't even looked at or answered. And like there's always somebody cold emailing me or cold calling me about a new position, right? So in some sense, these accolades and certifications starts to stack up. So it's like it's difficult to like separate out Princeton. And then there's another part to that, which is just like Princeton is hard, like really hard, especially if you do it for engineering. And that's a bad thing in some ways, but it's also a good thing because it means that like in some sense you're built for a lot.
Built different.
So like if you can do that, like you can do a lot. I would say I don't regret it, but I wouldn't necessarily I'm not one of those people that wants other people to go to Princeton. I wouldn't necessarily want my kids to go. I wouldn't
Okay.
necessarily recommend other people go. I think it's worth thinking about, and at the very least, it's worth balancing out your list of schools you want to go to between Ivy Leagues and non-Ivy Leagues and like the public school. For reasons that you've mentioned, right? Like financially speaking, like not everybody is going to school to get a high paying software engineering degree or a software engineering job.
Yeah.
Uh, Um, not everybody is trying to go and work in tech. Not everybody is interested in that stuff, especially when you start to drift out into these other places where people aren't necessarily interested in software engineering in general. But it's worth just thinking about a lot. So I wouldn't say I regret it. I would just say that like I have a different appreciation and understanding for it like after the.
Yeah, and I think it kinda depends on, like, what you want out of the situation, but hearing you talk about it, it seems like the biggest thing that you take away from it is, like, the network. Like, I'm sure that Princeton network, you got, like, some politicians, some BC people, like, it's probably a crazy Rolodex, but, and then also, like, the prestige that comes with it. But,
Yeah, it's by accident, honestly. Like, even the people you just meet in passing and like you kind of just, I don't know, maybe you connect with them on LinkedIn because you both went to school together and you were in some classes. And then you find out they're raising millions of dollars for a startup. And you're like, wow, it's so crazy sometimes. Like
yeah,
you never know like which person in your class is gonna be like the person that's like a startup founder at like 25 or something and raking in million. On a smaller scale, there's people working at a bunch of companies that you would like to work at, right? And you maybe shared a conversation with them. And I think there is power in that network, right? I've had people reach out to me to recommend them like just because we went to the same school. Like I didn't even know.
yeah.
So the network is so powerful in some ways that like I forget that it's there.
Gotcha. But there's always like this contrast and these competing interests versus like the practicality of education versus like the theory and everything like that. So like when you think about like boot camps, like that's purely practical. Like, hey, let's build a website within a week. And like let's learn HTML, let's learn CSS, let's learn JavaScript, let's learn React. And like you're moving at a quick and rapid pace and always building. What's when you in the college environment, so, like, if you do a boot camp, you're gonna walk away with, like, a portfolio of, like, websites you built, apps, and everything like that. Do you have that same opportunity in college, like, just from the coursework? Are you gonna be able to walk away with, like, "Hey, here's a project where we built a website or an app," or is it just, like, I know everything about algorithms and data structure and everything else?
Not unless you're intentional about it. I would say that the chances that you come out of college without doing any of that is low. Like at some point, you're probably going to build something that you can show, but there is very much the possibility that like, I don't know, say for whatever reason, you just want to take a bunch of theory courses and like you'll
Yeah.
take the minimal amount for like other like maybe type application type classes. So every university is different in terms of what they require for their CS degree. But for
Mhm.
Princeton, let's take some theory, some architecture and system stuff, and like some like application classes. So like you had to do that, but then like the rest of your, I guess, requirements were up to you. So you could very easily like pick classes that don't necessarily have a design project at the end. And,
Okay.
you have a problem set at the end or a final or something like that. And then you don't necessarily have too much stuff to talk about or to show. Right. And it's difficult, right? Because the earlier you know that, the earlier you can start to like think about, okay, like how do I separate this being a class that I think I should take from this is a class that will help me feel more confident as a software engineer. So you can take a theory class and like really know this like really abstract data structure that computer science theorists sit and talk about for like hours and hours on end and write proofs about, right? That's cool. It's not going to get you a job. Like, so in some sense, like if you don't understand that and you don't think about that, unless you really want to do that, you probably shouldn't, right? You should probably think about, okay, like this class has a design problem at the end and we have to build a piece of tech with a bunch of different stuff and I have to work in a group. So I have to collaborate. I have to think about a design. I have to work with a bunch of different technologies. If you're not intentional about that, at least from my experience at Princeton, like you might not necessarily have that at the end. And when I think about when I started to feel more confident as a software engineer, it was when I started to take more classes like that. Because the other thing is like there's not as much payoff when you finish class, like a theory class, right? Because like there's not like this moment in an interview where like your really hard discrete math class is going to suddenly translate into your interview unless you're going for a job for something like that. But the chances that that's happening is low. But there will come this moment where your interviewer is like, tell me about something that you did in the past. And then you
Yeah.
could be like, oh, I worked on this project for 4 weeks and it was hell. Let me tell you all about it. Right.
Yeah.
Like I worked with this tech and I was working with this guy who wouldn't push up his code correctly. And then we had a bunch of merge conflicts and we finally came up with a great design and we came in at the end. And then there's so many stories you can pull from that. Right. Because the other thing is, it's not just tech, right? It's not just, can you work with tech? It's, can you work with people? Can you work with a project? Can you come up with a design? Can you help with different parts of orchestrating that project progression? Right. So even you just being a code monkey isn't enough, right? You need to be able to pick things up on the fly. You need to be able to work in a group. You need to be able to communicate that out to non-tech people. So there's so many different skills. And so relying on your courses to like get you the job, I think is something I would really discourage people from doing.
I think that's all great stuff, man. Like, I think you gotta be, like, proactive in finding these opportunities outside of the classroom setting, or else you're gonna be really surprised when you start applying a job and you're not getting any because you don't have any, like, projects or skills that you can demonstrate on paper. And even I literally just interviewed somebody on another episode where, she kinda talks about, like, when she's looking at a resume, she's looking for the programming skill you have and then also interesting projects that you've worked on. And then if she interviews you, she's gonna be bringing those up and asking you questions about it to kinda test and see, like, how proficient are you? How well did you understand the problem and everything like that? I think a lot of people definitely miss that when they're going to college. They just think, "Hey, I'll get a degree and I'll get a job." But no, it's a lot of work you gotta do to get there. And it's surprising to me that, like, you're not the first person to say it. I met a boot camp instructor who said she had a computer science grad enroll in a boot camp because they didn't know, like, how to code, like, like, they had never produced anything. They didn't know how to code, basically. They knew the theory, but they didn't know how to code, and I'm thinking
Not
you
the
can.
same at all. Like
Huh?
it's really not. I think people have this misconception that like because you're a CS grad, you know how to code. That is not the case at all. In some sense,
That's
you're the
crazy.
same rate as other people. So if you're not intentional about it, it's so easy to come out of university and feel like you're learning everything on the job. I had to deal with that a lot. Like you've worked with, I'll give one example. So a lot of times, like the first class you take is in Java, right? So
Mhm.
Java is a popular language. A lot of organizations use it, right? At Princeton, Java was like there were like specific libraries built within the Princeton community for students to use to work on these problems, right? And then you go out into the real world and you have to work with Spring Boot or like any Java framework. And there's just endless amounts of documentation and you have to read through it all and understand it. And it's not just about reading it all and understanding it. It's about applying it, right? Because if you have to write code in Java and you have to read the docs all the time, right? In some sense, it would be great if you could like make it second nature and be like, okay, like I know this function does this and I know I can use this library to do this. And I don't have to go back to Google every time, right?
Yeah.
At a point, you want to feel like you can code without relying heavily on the internet. But unless you build that muscle in, like, how are you going to do that? Right. Because you need to understand like there's a whole open source system that a lot of these companies and if you're lucky, it's open source, right? If you're not lucky, the company has built a proprietary framework like that they use internally specifically for these languages. And it's like, if you're not aware of that, you're going to think like your little project for your like second algorithms course is going to prepare you to code. Like, no, it's not at all. And the more you can just face yourself with different technologies that you've never worked with before and like get something running, you start to notice themes emerge across things. And then the best part is that like, if you start to become strong in certain fundamentals, you don't have to feel like you're going back to the drawing board every time. So like if you get really good in writing in Python to build websites or Java to build websites, more so than what your class provides you, you can go into an organization and be like, hey, like, I don't know what you guys are doing, but I know that like I could probably figure it out
Mhm.
because I only learned this cloud resource and how it interacts with this language, right? Like I only have to learn one part of the problem. Or like Oh, that's another thing, right? Cloud, right? When are you touching cloud in school? Like, probably not. I didn't touch cloud until I was doing my design projects junior, senior year. So there's so many different parts. And like the past two companies I've worked at, like cloud has been so much of everything. In some sense, like if you could come out of college with a certification in cloud stuff, like that would put you so far ahead of so many people because it's like, hey, all these companies are using AWS, all these companies are using Google Cloud, all these
Mhm.
companies are using Microsoft Edge, and they always have to teach their like new hires like how to work with all this stuff. And if you could come in and say like, hey, like I built entirely scalable systems on the cloud, like from junior year onwards, like you're blowing people away.
I think this is why, like, hearing you and others talk about this is why I'm a really big fan of alternative, like, pathways into tech. And so, like, whether it's boot camps, apprenticeship programs, or whatever, I think, and then that also speaks to, I guess, like, why internships are like so important in college because it like actually lets you apply it and also get your foot in the door. What was your first full time job after college, and then how did you land that?
Yeah, so I started working at Capital One in July of 2018. So I got there because I'd interned the summer before. So I interned in the Richmond office and then I joined full time in the New York office. So that's how I got the job. So I think internships are also like a really great thing to keep in mind because if you can land an internship and if you perform well, oftentimes there's talks about return offers. So it's a bit easier on you psychologically when you're trying to go for your first job when you have well, I only had one internship. Imagine if you did an internship every summer, right? So that's something I would have people keep in mind. So my first job, it was pretty much a data team. So I was working with a lot of like AWS data for Capital One. I was learning a lot of these tools like for the first time. So I was working with the Python seriously for the first time, right? That actually like wasn't that difficult, I would say, because there are people around you and they're happy to help. So that's the other thing.
Mm.
Like you can find a team where there's a decent amount of senior engineering presence, or not even necessarily senior, but also just like people with like a couple years of experience. I think it's easier for you, like when you first join. So I had that. But I think the other thing was just like, so we talked a lot about like just the engineering side of things, right? But then there's this whole other side to working in a company, which is just like the fact that you're working in a company. It's not just purely engineering anymore. So I had to get used to a lot of like organizational structures and project management and keeping things on track, communicating with technical and non-technical people. I would say like it's not it's not enough, I guess, to just understand the engineering part of things. It's also important to understand like you are part of a whole. And so especially when you're younger, like you have less influence on that whole. So how can you find a space where either like you have opportunities to have a say or like the environment is set for you to focus on what you should be focusing on, which is being a good engineer and like learning how to do that. It was a lot of like, I guess, just understanding what the work world is like. It
Yeah.
was just different from what I was expecting. But I think listening and watching and paying attention, I like started to learn how to sort of balance being both an engineer and being a team member and like how you can not only like be a good engineer, but how you can keep projects on track because it's not enough for you to just be a good engineer, right?
Yeah, no, it's definitely, I think, a culture shock, like, as you make those transitions from one to the other. I mean, I think, like, college, it kinda gives you, like, a false sense of reality in a way, and, definitely, like, when you get into the work culture, it's completely different. I remember us talking beforehand, like, while you were at Capital One, that's when you got introduced to people that had non-traditional pathways, whether it was, like, boot camps or associate's degrees or whatever. Can you kinda talk about that experience overall? And then also, does Capital One have any initiatives that people can look out for?
Yes, Capital One, I was working with people that obviously went to non-Ivy League schools. They didn't even necessarily have like STEM related backgrounds, let alone a CS background. You don't even need a CS degree to get a software engineering job. It's more about just having the skill set. Capital One has this program called CODA. So with CODA, this is a boot camp that's 6 months. And so when I joined in July of 2018, Capital One brought their new hires to Virginia for like the first week. So it was engineers, like the tech development program, like that's what I was in. So everybody that was in the tech development program was actually onboarding at the same time as people in the CODA program. I didn't know like there was this whole program like where you could come in with not necessarily an engineering background, work for 6 months, get paid, and then transition into the tech development program. Whereas we're just joining in the tech development program, right? So they're just 6 months behind us, but like eventually they're going to come in and like do the same thing as us. So at a
Same
certain
work,
point,
same pay.
same work, same pay. And so you look around and you go like, um, why didn't I do that? Like, that sounds pretty cool. I'm not totally familiar on what the application process is in. Like, I don't want to sell it as like everybody can just join it, right? And I don't want to sell it as like people with no coding experiences all can get it, right? But I say that to say that like there is an opportunity for people that are interested in software engineering that don't necessarily have the experience or the educational background.
And how long were
So
you there at Capital One before you went to Chainalysis?
3.5 years.
3.5 years. Okay. Did you like progress up there before you moved on to Chainalysis, or did you just kind of like stay in the same
Yes,
role?
I got promoted. Was it? It was like 2 years. I think it was 2 years into my time there.
Okay.
So basically, I was in a rotational program. So um, I was on a team for a year, and then I was on a team for the second year, and then at that point, I graduated. I just stayed on the second team, and at the end, I also like kind of graduated. So
That's dope.
yeah, so I graduated and got promoted, and then I stayed on for some more time, and then I just left. So yeah.
Nice. Now, I think those are great opportunities because they give you a chance to see like what do you like, what do you dislike. And I think the thing is, you're an engineer. It's not like you can't pivot and go like to business or marketing if you want to at some point. So even flexibility beyond like your current like technical role, like it's not like hey, you're gonna say hey, I want to go to business, and somebody's gonna say no, you're not smart enough. Like you work on challenging problems all day, so like you proving your competency and your ability to learn and adapt.
You bring up an interesting point, right? Like even as an engineer, like it doesn't stop there because you're working with like
Yeah,
engineers, the whole team, right? There's management, there's product management. If you're like working in an agile type environment, there's scrum masters that keep the project moving,
yeah,
right? So you like hear stories of people switching into product. That's like not uncommon, right? And then like obviously there's like moving into people management as you like get further in your career, right? So you're not necessarily doing the day-to-day coding, but you're managing engineers. Maybe you stay on the engineering track and you just want to like code and not necessarily like worry about managing people, right? So and then you can move into architects. So like maybe you're not necessarily like coding things like from A to Z, but you're like, hey, I think this is like the approach we want to take for this problem,
yeah,
right? There's flavors of engineering in different parts of the process that are useful, right? There's also design, right? So if you're not necessarily on the data side of things, but if you're doing front end stuff, right? You're building the websites, all the different visualizations. Maybe you like dip into designing. Like, I don't know. There's like a bunch of different parts to an engineering team to make it work. And depending on the problem, you're exposed to different parts of that process.
so, man, I wanna cover, like, how you got your job at Chainalysis because I know we were talking before, and it was kinda like a random thing or not random, but it's a unique situation, I think. So can you kinda tell us, like, how did you land your job at Chainalysis once you left Capital One?
Yeah, actually, this might be useful to talk about. So I think one of the challenges I think you run into as an engineer is like, I guess I could call it interviewing anxiety. So like interviewing as an engineer can be stressful. So you probably have multiple rounds. You probably have multiple technical questions of varying difficulty. And they all, unfortunately, this is the one like moment where like CS majors might have a leg up. This is the one place where it
Mm,
might be, they all kind of go back to like that first year or two of your CS career, right? So like it's all a bunch of algorithms questions and it's all like, dynamic programming, sorting, graphs, like all the stuff that you don't necessarily do on the day to day. So I think that at least for me, that promoted a lot of anxiety because it wasn't like I was necessarily great at those things, right? So I think I held off on interviewing. And so I think the thing that really got me my job was just getting comfortable with just trying. So like not using preparation, like, oh, I need to study more. I need to prepare more. I need to do more questions.
Yeah,
Not that as like a reason to not interview. It's like I can just interview and like eventually I get it. And then what you start to realize is it's less about being prepared and it's more about just applying in general. Right. So like no matter how prepared you are, if you get a bad question, like that's it. That's the interview. Right.
I
So
gotcha.
you could have a whole day like studying trees and then they give you a dynamic programming problem and then you're done. Right. So in some sense, like if you put all your eggs into one basket and you're like, okay, I'm going to study, I'm going to study, I'm going to study, and then I still have this interview and I'm all ready to go, and then you get it, like, and then you don't get it, right? Like in some sense, you lose some of that confidence. Where it's
I
just
gotcha.
like keep applying, and I just keep trying these things. Maybe I can start to like pick this up on the fly, and like maybe I can just start to understand in the same way that like going back to our conversation about going from high school to college, like understanding how the SAT works or like developing a strategy for that. It's like,
Yeah.
how can I develop a strategy to interview? So that's I think the biggest thing that got me my job was just interviewing more and more and just like slamming my calendar with like interviews. Right. So shotgunning and like starting to leverage that network, right. Of just people that were asking me to interview and just
So
like
you had
taking those up.
people you had sorry to cut you off. So you just had people, like, hitting you up like, "Yo, we got a role. I think you'd be good for it," or, like, how was that? So instead of you applying to the jobs, like, people were finding you?
Yeah. So most of my applications this time around were not me seeking things out. It was just me finally starting to reply to like the giant backlog of people.
Uh,
Less
so you had, like, a
again.
bunch of recruiters in your DMs and you like, "You know what? Let me just ignore these because I don't feel like I'm ready to interview for it," and then you're like, "You know what? I'm good enough. Let me, like, start hitting some of them back."
Yeah, like, and this is kind of like, again, to your point of like, how does Princeton help? It's like, how much of that was Princeton? How much of that was Capital One? How much of that was like all the different skills that I put on my LinkedIn profile? The answer is like a little of everything, right? So
Yeah.
the more time you initially take care into putting your LinkedIn profile out there, I think the easier it is and the greater ROI you get, right? Because a lot of times these recruiters aren't like necessarily like really versed in like the things you're going to be working on, but they're looking for a couple key points to at least offer you the interview. So if you can at least check off a couple boxes off of a search, right? You can start to open up at least the opportunity for you to enter, and then you can deal with the rest of that later, right? So it's really not uncommon, I think, for engineers to see that happen, right? Like and I think once you develop skills and like have some experience, I think that's when it starts to like really start to pile up. So it didn't happen as much like when I first started, obviously, because like I had no experience. I didn't know what to put on my LinkedIn profile. But then like you start to work with all these different services. Maybe you get a couple certifications. That's another thing to think about, right? So I've been certified in AWS twice. So I have the solutions architect stuff. When you have certifications and things like that, experiences, that's when things start to get interesting for you. But yeah, in terms of applying and the interviewing and stuff. So the other thing is like, there's like some companies will apply to you directly, and then other then other people that apply to you will be from like recruiting companies. So they won't just have
Mhm.
one; they'll have multiple offers for you. And like obviously, like they would like to get you placed in a job because that's good for them. So
So
like
they get paid.
they won't come to you with one, they'll come to you with like five. And if the five don't work, they have 10 waiting for you. So Chainalysis was one of those companies that I got through that. So a recruiter reached out with a bunch of different options. um, and I just happened to apply. Luckily, I was at a point where like I liked the companies that I was applying to. I just had to decide. I was deciding between two, Chainalysis and one other company. And I think the reason why I chose Chainalysis was primarily for the interview process and the people. It wasn't a huge difference in terms of the offer. I will say that Chainalysis offer was better, but like it wasn't like so much so that I didn't consider the other offer. I would say that I think the interview process for me, like there was such a care that was taken to like making sure that I got through the process and like didn't feel overly stressed about it. And also that I was coming in at the right role, right? Because I guess another thing to think about is like, where do you, this is a very specific kind of problem, but like after your first job, if you're 3.5 years, where do you rank in terms of like engineering position, right? Like,
Yeah.
are you a senior? Are you a mid? Right. So there was a bit of that conversation coming in. So luckily, like I had that conversation with one of the people at Chainalysis, and they were able to help me like pick a position that made sense for me. So like I think I originally was offered like the recruiter initially came to me like with a senior position, and then they were like, hey, like how would you feel about going to a software engineering two position? And I was like, that sounds exactly what I want. Like I want to work my way up to senior. So I think just that kind of focus and care and like understanding that the process is a stressful one. I
Yeah.
think it was actually one of the more pleasurable experiences I've had interview wise. Like,
Yeah. Real quick, what's the advantage of like instead of taking the mid versus a senior level? Is it like expectations? What was kind of like the motivation behind that decision?
yeah, because like if you come in as a senior, right, you have to ramp up a bit quicker. You have to like tackle these problems like kind of on your own and kind of come home in with your own solutions. Like it's not in some sense like of course you can ask for help, but like people are gonna kind of look for you for help too. Like so like I didn't necessarily feel like I was in that position yet. And I wanted to understand how to be a senior before I became a senior,
Gotcha.
and especially and even in the interview process, also like the interview process would have been different. So I guess one of the ways I knew this was the right decision was because like this was only after the fact. But then I came in and I saw somebody that joined as a senior, like around the same time as me. And I just saw the difference in how quickly he ramped up. And I was like, yeah, that's,
You made the right
and
choice.
yeah, I saw how quickly he ramped up. And then I saw like the other senior people that I'm working with. And I was like, thank you for telling me this during the interview. Like,
Yeah, the reason I asked that is because I think a lot of times we just originally think about like the money tied to the position. Like, hey, senior is gonna make more than mid, but then also you have
yeah,
to think about like the expectations that come along with it. Like people are gonna be coming to you for solutions and everything else that you discuss. You're a Princeton grad. Your parents, although they've kind of put you in a position for success, they're kind of looking at like, hey, what's next? Like, hey, we need another diploma on the wall or something. So I kind of want to ask you, like, how do you envision success and what's kinda like your future goals in terms of being successful?
I think for me specifically, I think the trajectory for the next couple of years is one, like making that transition to senior. So really starting to feel like I can like tackle an engineering problem from beginning to end and have like the right insight for the right problem. I think one thing that stuck with me is like one of my managers at Capital One was like, you ask really good questions. I think it's time for you to start trying to figure out the answers to those questions on your own. So I think a good way of knowing that you're reaching that mid level of software engineering is like when you can start to ask questions that push the project or the conversation forward in a way that's useful. I
Mhm.
think that's where I'm at now. And then the second part of that is like when you can start to come up with those questions and also come up with the answer at the same time. I think that's when you start to move to senior. And then for me, my goal right now is to one step past that, which is going to people management. So I think that's where I've really seen myself kind of thrive. So I've been lucky to have mentoring experiences in the past, like particularly at Capital One. So because it's a rotational program, there's always new grads kind of on the team. So being able to coach them and help them to understand what they want from their engineering experience and what they ultimately want to do, but also just to help them kind of think through what's going on in the team and how they can contribute and kind of work through that first little hump of like, I'm a new grad and I'm on a team, but I don't feel like I can contribute. And like, I remember like there was kind of this moment where I realized like these people are a lot older than me and like they like certainly have more experience, but like when it really comes down to it, like you can really like contribute more than you think. Like there's a lot of blind spots. There's a lot of moments where people miss something that's kind of obvious. There's a lot of like communication issues where people think that people know what the other person are saying, right?
Yeah.
And then moments where like people feel like something is wrong, but nobody says something. So like mentoring people through all of that and kind of helping them to understand that these thoughts and these ideas that they have are not like crazy, I think is sort of where I thrive. So I'm definitely more interested in the people side, but I think also I want to be on the tech side because I I think it's great when you can provide your direct reports, not just people support, but also tech support, right? So like helping them to understand the problems that they're working with and helping them to build those skills and those muscles that we talked about, right? So when you leave my team, ideally like you'll start to be able to build the muscles to like go into any engineering problem and be like, okay, like I'm thinking this, let's try and run with that and see if it works.
Yeah. I could definitely see you, like, in that teacher role, you know, kinda like, I say mentor/teacher, like, where, like, you kind of taking these lessons that you've learned from your own experiences and career, and you've built your own skill set and your own muscle memory in terms of, like, tech technical competency, but now it's like, hey, working with others to kinda make sure that they can sharpen those skills, so I think that's really respectable, and then also, man, I just feel like a lot of us from our community, they always have, like, that I don't know what it is, but that passion, that fire to kinda, like, give back and help others, and it sounds like you have the same thing, so I think that's really cool.
Yeah. It's so much fun to watch um anybody that you mentor. It's like the most fun to see them like feel like
Yeah.
they're
It's the most fulfilling thing, man. It's like, I don't know, like, even I've worked with interns and, like, undergrads in college and stuff, and it's like, when you see the light bulb go off and, like, they get it, and
yeah.
they're able to, like, you can see the growth, like, there's nothing more rewarding than that, so, um, it's awesome, it's awesome. Man, so, I mean, it's been a minute, so I gotta let you go, I'm way overdue. But bro, I really appreciate you, like, coming on here, sharing your story. I think people can really take a lot from, like, your story, and hopefully they can figure out, "Hey, number 1, like, is college right for me?" Number 1, but then number 2, like, "Do I wanna go to an Ivy League or not?" And then even beyond that, like, all the success that you've had in your career, I feel like people can really gain a lot from what you've kind of shared with us today, so I appreciate it. Um, I do always wanna give the guests the opportunity to just make any shout outs or announce anything that they have going on, and then also how people can find you, so feel free to kinda take it from here and let people know how they can find you or anything that you got going on that they should check out.
Yeah. Always happy to tell stories and kind of tell people what I've been going through and what I've been thinking about. Cause in some sense, it helps me know I'm not crazy. And sometimes people find these things useful. So really happy to do that. Um, Not necessarily working on anything except everything I'm doing at analysis. But if people are interested in talking more about these kinds of things, find me on LinkedIn, message me. I think the main point behind all of them is that like a lot of these questions are not like yes or no things. They're like how, right?
Mhm.
It's not necessarily like going to college is like a yes or no thing. It's just like, how do you want to do it? Right? Like, does it align with your desired result? It's not like going to an Ivy League thing is like a yes or no thing. It's like,
Yeah.
does it align with your desired result? And like, are you ready for the like what comes with it? Same thing with a job. Like everything is like a multivariate analysis. And so like no decision is wrong as long as you've understood what you're hoping to get out of it and like what you need to put into it. So, I kind of like raise these questions and like kind of talk about these experiences because I think like there's always room for people to like really think about what they think, I don't know, success is or like what the right path is or things like that. And then like you go out into the wild and then you see people with vastly different stories and vastly different experiences. And like even the people that have gone through what you think you should go through are not necessarily like the obvious like result, you know?
Yeah.
Food for thought.
I love it. I appreciate that advice, those words of wisdom. Bro, like, I'm gonna have to get you back on here at some point. We can talk about more about crypto. I'm trying to learn as much as I can. I'm pretty sure you got like the whole playbook. You said you too?
Me too, man. What's going on? Oh, and honestly.
All right, cool, man. We'll figure it out together, bro. But man, thanks again for coming on. For you all that are watching, I appreciate you tuning in. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube. Also, feel free to follow us on all social media platforms at Custom Journeys. That's CUSTEM Journeys, JOURNEYS. This has been another great episode of the Custom Journeys podcast. I'm Andrew Baines. Glad to be joined today by Richard Henry, and we'll see you all next week. Peace.